Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. Imagine a world where disasters, some of the most tragic and defining moments in history, could have been prevented. What if I told you that the Titanic sinking, the attack on Pearl Harbor, and even major financial crashes were all predicted before they happened? Not by time travelers or psychics, but by experts, whistleblowers, and even ordinary people who saw the warning signs long before disaster struck. And yet, time and time again, those warnings were ignored. Throughout history, there have been individuals who sounded the alarm, only to be dismissed, silenced, or ridiculed. Sometimes the warnings were buried under bureaucracy. Other times, they were overlooked due to arrogance, greed, or simple disbelief. But in many cases, hindsight reveals that if people had only listened, tragedy could have been avoided. From engineers warning about structural weaknesses to intelligence officers predicting military attacks, and even economists forecasting market collapses, history is filled with examples of ignored warnings that led to catastrophe. In this video, we're diving deep into some of the most chilling cases where people tried to stop disaster, only to be brushed aside. And as we uncover these stories, one question will keep coming up. Why do we so often fail to listen until it's too late? The Titanic is one of history's most infamous disasters, a tragic event that could have been prevented if key warnings had been taken seriously. In the days and hours leading up to the sinking, multiple warnings were sent to the Titanic about dangerous icebergs in the North Atlantic. Yet despite these alerts, the ship continued at nearly full speed, heading straight into disaster. Several ships traveling ahead of the Titanic sent messages reporting heavy ice in the area. On April 14, 1912, the SS Californian and the RMS Caronia both sent warnings about large ice fields. Later in the evening, the Mesaba sent another message, specifically alerting ships in the area about dangerous ice. But these warnings either didn't reach the right people or were dismissed as routine. In fact, the Titanic's radio operators, overwhelmed with handling personal messages for wealthy passengers, reportedly ignored some of the iceberg warnings or failed to relay them to the captain. Despite these clear signs of danger, the Titanic maintained a speed of about 22 knots, just shy of its maximum, because the ship's owners wanted to maintain an impressive travel time for its maiden voyage. There was a belief that the ship was practically unsinkable, and many assumed that even if an iceberg was encountered, the Titanic's size and construction would protect it from serious damage. At 11:40 p.m., the Titanic struck an iceberg. The collision ripped a series of gashes along the hull, flooding multiple compartments. Within hours, the unsinkable ship was at the bottom of the Atlantic, and over 1,500 people lost their lives. The aftermath of the Titanic disaster led to major changes in maritime safety. Regulations were introduced to require ships to carry enough lifeboats for all passengers, something Titanic had lacked. Continuous radio monitoring became mandatory, so crucial messages would no longer go unheard. The International Ice Patrol was also established to track iceberg movements and prevent similar tragedies. But while these changes saved lives, history has shown that the same pattern of ignored warnings leading to catastrophe has repeated itself. From aviation disasters to financial collapses, the tendency to dismiss early warnings, whether due to overconfidence, negligence, or financial pressures, remains a recurring theme. The Titanic is just one example of what happens when those in charge choose not to listen to the signs of impending danger. In the months leading up to the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States had multiple warnings that Japan was planning something big. U.S. intelligence had intercepted Japanese diplomatic and military communications, revealing increasing tensions and potential hostile actions. Despite this, the attack on December 7, 1941, caught the American military off guard, leading to devastating losses and forcing the U.S. into World War II. For much of 1941, Japan and the U.S. had been locked in tense negotiations. Japan was expanding aggressively in Asia, and the U.S. responded by cutting off oil and steel exports, crippling Japan's war machine. American intelligence, particularly the Office of Naval Intelligence and the Army's Signal Intelligence Service, had been monitoring Japanese communications. They had even cracked a key Japanese diplomatic code known as Purple, allowing them to read many Japanese messages. Several intercepted messages hinted at an imminent attack, but the exact target remained unclear. Some intelligence officials believed the Philippines, Guam, or British territories in Southeast Asia were more likely targets than Hawaii. On December 6th, the day before the attack, President Franklin D. Roosevelt even received an intelligence briefing suggesting that Japan was preparing for war. But because of miscommunication, bureaucratic delays, and a general underestimation of Japan's capabilities, no immediate action was taken to prepare Pearl Harbor for an attack. At 7:55 a.m. on December 7, 1941, Japan launched a surprise assault on the U.S. Pacific Fleet stationed at Pearl Harbor. Over 350 Japanese aircraft bombed and torpedoed battleships, cruisers, and airfields. In just under 2 hours, more than 2,400 Americans were killed, nearly 200 aircraft were destroyed, and 8 battleships were either sunk or heavily damaged. The attack was a catastrophic blow, pushing the U.S. into World War II the next day. In the aftermath, there was widespread outrage over the intelligence failures that led to Pearl Harbor being so vulnerable. This led to major reforms in how the U.S. handled intelligence. The attack directly influenced the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, and the restructuring of the military's intelligence operations. Greater emphasis was placed on coordinating information between branches of the military and government agencies to prevent future surprise attacks. However, history repeated itself decades later. In the months leading up to September 11, 2001, U.S. intelligence agencies once again intercepted warnings of an impending attack by al-Qaeda. Much like in 1941, the warnings were not acted upon in time. Bureaucratic inefficiencies, miscommunication, and a failure to connect key intelligence pieces contributed to the success of the 9/11 attacks. The lesson from Pearl Harbor is clear. Intelligence is only useful if it is properly analyzed, communicated, and acted upon. But as history has shown, even when warnings exist, human error, skepticism, and bureaucratic red tape can allow disasters to unfold. The 2008 financial crisis wasn't an unforeseen disaster. It was a slow-moving train wreck that many experts saw coming. For years leading up to the crash, economists, financial analysts, and insiders had warned that the U.S. housing market was in a dangerous bubble, fueled by reckless lending, financial speculation, and weak regulation. Yet those warnings were ignored or dismissed by banks, regulators, and even the government. When the bubble burst, it triggered the worst global financial crisis since the Great Depression. In the early 2000s, banks and mortgage lenders began offering risky home loans to borrowers who, under normal circumstances, wouldn't have qualified. These subprime mortgages often came with low initial interest rates that would later skyrocket, making it nearly impossible for borrowers to keep up with payments. Banks bundled these risky loans into complex financial products called mortgage-backed securities and sold them to investors, making billions in the process. Meanwhile, credit rating agencies, who were supposed to evaluate the risk, gave these securities top ratings, making them seem much safer than they actually were. However, some experts saw the danger. Economists like Robert Shiller and financial insiders like hedge fund manager Michael Burry warned that the housing market was in a massive bubble and that when it popped, the entire financial system could collapse. Even as late as 2007, when housing prices began to fall and mortgage defaults started rising, top banking executives and government officials reassured the public that the market was fundamentally strong. Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke famously stated in 2007 that he believed the housing downturn would be limited and wouldn't impact the broader economy. But by 2008, the reality could no longer be ignored. Mortgage defaults skyrocketed, and financial institutions that had invested heavily in subprime loans faced massive losses. The crisis reached its peak in September 2008, when Lehman Brothers, a major investment bank, collapsed, sending shockwaves through the global economy. Stock markets crashed, millions of people lost their homes and jobs, and governments worldwide had to step in with massive bailout packages to prevent a complete economic meltdown. In the aftermath, major regulatory changes were introduced to prevent a repeat of the crisis. The Dodd-Frank Act was passed in the U.S., bringing stricter rules on banks and financial institutions. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, CFPB, was created to oversee mortgage lending and protect consumers from predatory loans. Banks were required to hold more capital to cushion against future crises, and risky trading practices were restricted. But are we repeating history? Some experts believe so. In recent years, concerns have grown about rising corporate debt, overinflated stock markets, and risky financial practices creeping back into the system. While regulations have tightened, financial institutions have found new loopholes, and the same kind of speculative behavior that led to the 2008 crash still exists in different forms. The lesson from the financial crisis is clear. Ignoring economic red flags can lead to devastating consequences. The real question is whether we've truly learned from the past, or if we're heading toward another financial disaster. The Chernobyl disaster of 1986 was not just a tragic accident. It was a catastrophe that could have been prevented if warnings from engineers and scientists had been taken seriously. Long before the explosion, experts had raised concerns about the safety of the RBMK nuclear reactors used in Soviet power plants. But in a system where secrecy, bureaucracy, and a fear of questioning authority were the norm, those warnings were ignored. The result was one of the worst nuclear disasters in history. In the years leading up to Chernobyl, Soviet engineers had identified flaws in the RBMK reactor design, particularly a dangerous instability at low power and the use of graphite tips on control rods, which could actually increase reactivity instead of reducing it during shutdown procedures. Some scientists and nuclear experts voiced their concerns, warning that in certain conditions, the reactor could become uncontrollable. However, Soviet officials dismissed these warnings, prioritizing rapid industrial progress over safety. Speaking out against government policies or questioning the integrity of Soviet technology was often met with career-ending consequences, or worse. On the night of April 25, 1986, reactor operators at Chernobyl's Reactor 4 were conducting a safety test to see how long the turbines could power the cooling pumps in the event of a power failure. However, due to delays, the test was carried out under unsafe conditions, at dangerously low power levels, exactly the situation the reactor was most unstable in. When engineers attempted to shut it down, the design flaw in the control rods caused a sudden and massive spike in reactivity. Within seconds, a powerful steam explosion blew the reactor apart, sending radioactive material high into the atmosphere. The explosion released massive amounts of radiation, contaminating large areas of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, and eventually spreading across Europe. The Soviet government initially tried to cover up the disaster, refusing to acknowledge the scale of the crisis. It wasn't until Swedish scientists detected unusual radiation levels that the world realized something had gone horribly wrong. By the time the Soviet leadership admitted the severity of the accident, thousands of people had already been exposed to lethal doses of radiation. In the aftermath, Chernobyl became a turning point for nuclear safety worldwide. The disaster exposed serious flaws in both reactor design and the Soviet Union's culture of secrecy. It led to major improvements in international nuclear safety regulations, including stricter reactor designs, better emergency protocols, and increased transparency. The International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, introduced new safety measures to prevent similar disasters. However, despite these improvements, history repeated itself with the Fukushima nuclear disaster in 2011. In that case, warnings about the risk of a major earthquake and tsunami affecting the plant were ignored. The result was another catastrophic meltdown. Chernobyl's lesson is clear. Ignoring expert warnings, whether due to arrogance, bureaucracy, or fear of political repercussions, can have deadly consequences. When it comes to nuclear power, or any potentially catastrophic technology, safety should never take a backseat to politics or profit. For decades before COVID-19, scientists and public health experts warned that the world was vulnerable to a global pandemic. Virologists, epidemiologists, and even government officials had repeatedly sounded the alarm that new infectious diseases could spread rapidly due to global travel, urbanization, and inadequate healthcare preparedness. Yet, when COVID-19 emerged, in late 2019, many governments and institutions were caught off guard, leading to devastating consequences. Warnings about pandemics were not new. As early as the early 2000s, experts raised concerns after the SARS outbreak in 2002-2003, which was also caused by a coronavirus, the H1N1 influenza pandemic in 2009, and the Ebola outbreaks in Africa further demonstrated the risks of new and emerging diseases. In 2015, Bill Gates famously warned during a TED Talk that the world was not prepared for the next pandemic, stating that a highly contagious virus could spread worldwide and overwhelm healthcare systems. Scientists and medical experts had also urged governments to invest in stronger disease surveillance, stockpile protective equipment, and develop rapid response plans. Yet, when COVID-19 began spreading in Wuhan, China, in late 2019, many governments hesitated to take action. By January 2020, reports of human-to-human transmission had already surfaced, but some leaders downplayed the risks. Travel continued largely unchecked, and countries failed to prepare by ramping up testing, securing medical supplies, or implementing quarantine measures early. Even when cases started appearing in multiple countries, many assumed the outbreak could be contained. As a result, by the time the world realized the true severity of COVID-19, it was too late to prevent a global pandemic. Healthcare systems in many countries were overwhelmed, supply chains collapsed, and lockdowns were enforced in a desperate attempt to slow the virus. Millions of lives were lost, and the economic impact was staggering. In the aftermath, governments and health organizations have attempted to learn from the mistakes of COVID-19. There have been efforts to improve global cooperation on disease surveillance, strengthen supply chains for medical equipment, and invest in vaccine research and development. The World Health Organization and other health agencies have emphasized the need for early warning systems and rapid response protocols. However, whether the world is truly prepared for the next pandemic remains uncertain. History shows that, after each pandemic, there is a period of increased awareness and reform, but as time passes, complacency sets in. The 1918 Spanish flu killed millions, yet within decades, many of its lessons were forgotten. If the warnings of experts had been heeded before COVID-19, perhaps the crisis could have been mitigated. The key question now is whether governments and societies will take long-term preventative measures, or if the next pandemic will once again catch the world off guard. For decades, scientists and environmental experts have warned that climate change poses one of the greatest threats to human civilization. From rising global temperatures to extreme weather events, the evidence has been overwhelming. Yet, despite countless reports, urgent warnings, and increasing real-world consequences, meaningful action has been slow, and many governments and industries continue to downplay or delay serious climate policies. The question remains, will we listen this time, or are we repeating the same mistakes that led to past preventable disasters? The warnings about climate change date back as early as the 19th century, when scientists first recognized the relationship between carbon dioxide, CO2, and global temperature. By the late 20th century, climate models predicted that greenhouse gas emissions from human activity, mainly the burning of fossil fuels, would lead to global warming, melting ice caps, rising sea levels, and more extreme weather patterns. Reports from the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, have consistently stated that if emissions are not drastically reduced, the planet will face severe and irreversible consequences. Despite these dire warnings, efforts to curb climate change have been met with resistance. Fossil fuel industries, political interests, and misinformation campaigns have played a major role in delaying action. Many governments have been reluctant to enforce strict environmental regulations due to economic concerns, short-term political goals, and pressure from powerful corporations. Even when agreements like the Paris Climate Accord were established, to limit global warming, many countries have struggled to meet their targets, and some have even withdrawn from climate commitments. The consequences of inaction are already visible. Wildfires have become more frequent and intense, devastating forests and communities from California to Australia. Hurricanes and typhoons are stronger due to warming oceans, causing massive destruction and loss of life. Heat waves are breaking records, leading to droughts, water shortages, and agricultural failures. Rising sea levels threaten coastal cities, with some places already experiencing permanent flooding. Scientists predict that if warming continues, unchecked, entire ecosystems could collapse. Millions of people could be displaced due to extreme weather and rising seas, and global food and water supplies could be at risk. The big question is, will we listen before it's too late? Unlike disasters like the Titanic, Pearl Harbor, or the financial crisis, where warnings were ignored but eventually led to reforms, climate change is a slow-moving crisis that doesn't have a clear point of no return. Some scientists warn that we may already be approaching tipping points, where melting ice caps and deforestation will accelerate warming beyond our ability to reverse it. However, there is still hope. Renewable energy technologies like solar and wind power are becoming more affordable and widespread. Some countries are making significant strides in reducing emissions and investing in green infrastructure. Public awareness is growing, with younger generations demanding action through protests, lawsuits, and activism. But whether these efforts will be enough to prevent the worst outcomes depends on whether governments, businesses, and societies take the warning seriously and act decisively. History has shown that humanity often ignores warnings until disaster strikes. The difference this time is that if we fail to act on climate change, the consequences could be more devastating than anything we've faced before. Will we learn from the past? Or will the warnings of scientists today become another tragic, "I told you so" moment in history? Throughout history, time and time again, warnings have been ignored, sometimes out of arrogance, sometimes due to bureaucracy, and sometimes because the consequences seemed too distant to take seriously. The Titanic's ignored iceberg warnings, the intelligence failures before Pearl Harbor and 9/11, the financial red flags before the 2008 crash, and the overlooked safety concerns at Chernobyl all show that disasters rarely come without warning. Even with pandemics and climate change, experts raised alarms long before the crises unfolded, but too often, the response came too late. The key lesson here is simple. We must start listening to experts, scientists, and whistleblowers before disaster strikes. While skepticism and debate are healthy, outright dismissal of credible warnings has led to tragic consequences. Being aware of risks, demanding accountability from leaders, and taking action in our own lives can help prevent future catastrophes. So now I want to hear from you. What warnings do you think the world is ignoring today? Are there threats on the horizon that people aren't paying enough attention to? Let me know in the comments, and let's start a conversation about how we can learn from the past to build a better future. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into history. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.